All right, and here we are. The final video of our final book. Okay, not our final video. I'll have one more video next week, but at least this is the last one we're actually just discussing a text. And yeah, done with reading in this class. But what a way to end, right? Even if this is your least favorite Harry Potter book, and it is not everybody's, judging from your comments from last week. Some of you still really like this book or like other books less than this one. So even if it's not the best Harry Potter book, it's still Harry Potter, it's still magic, and it is still so much fun to talk about. So this video might get a little long, just a lot of things that I can't help myself that we're going to be talking about today. First things first, so referencing our discussion from last week when we were talking about language, magic language, I have to bring up Parseltongue now that we know a little bit more about it. Unlike the Latin-based spells, this is an actual magic language, right? Or, it's at least an animal language, a snake language, right? But is it magic because of that? Because it's just the language of snakes? Or is it magic because you have to be born with some ability to speak and understand it? In the comments last week, there was a little bit of a thread, some of you talking about how strange it was that bloodlines seem to be such a big focus, since magical power doesn't necessarily seem to rely on bloodlines super closely, talking about muggle-born wizards and witches like Hermione or Squibs. I'll just jump in here and say, yes and no. It does matter a little bit. Bloodlines do matter a little bit, right? Because if you're born to a wizard family, you are far more likely to be a wizard. And then, then we get Parseltongue, this Parseltongue language, which does seem to be an inherited magical ability. And it's a little bit of a strange one, or just strange to think about, I think, because language, human or otherwise, is always learned. Even these magical spells, they're born with power, but they're not born with the knowledge of speaking these magical spells. But Parseltongue doesn't work that way. You're born with it. You're born with the ability to speak it. Or in Harry's case, you are magically transferred the ability to speak it. And what are the implications of that? And just what are the implications of sharing a language with a species in general, right? With snakes, snakes are automatically seen as evil. That goes back through religion. Adam and Eve's story seems to influence everything, right? But it does make me wonder, why aren't there other magical languages or magical animal languages in this world? Why don't the dragons speak? Because we do have some precedent for that in other magical books, but not here. Anyway, I don't have anything necessarily super insightful to say about this, just couldn't help passing up talking about Parseltongue, because it is fascinating, interesting to think about the way this magical language works in this world. But gotta quickly move on to talking about the article for this week. So I saved this article for the very last, because this is the kind of work and the kind of thinking about materials used in bookmaking and writing. This is the kind of research that I do for reals. And so it's really fun for me to get to end talking about this by bringing up this kind of work in Harry Potter. Super fun. So I hope as you were reading that you were paying attention to the use of quills and parchment and scrolls and many, many, many books that show up in this world. And I don't know if it struck you before. I hope it has, right? As you're reading through these books, why are these wizards still using ink bottles and feather quill pens in an era of laptops, right? Computers existed when this series started. And this article offers some great thoughts, so I'm just going to read I bet this is from page 58. But mostly witches and wizards use very human ways of getting words to one another or taking note of what they think. They write on scrolls and keep ink pots. They use quills and send sealed letters. What is striking about these activities is not that the methods are magical, but that they are antique. Muggles once did much the same as wizards. They sealed their letters with wax and had local scribes, such as Simon Weisbeck, copy magic spells into their recipe books using quills. Yet they did so in a medieval rather than a modern age. Right. So one way of thinking about this is that it's like how they use candles, or how the school has to be in a castle instead of some modern glass building, or any of the other details in this world. There's this term that we use called medievalism. This is all a form of medievalism, which is a term we use to talk about well, what we do in fantasy and magic stories to make it feel fantastical and to make it feel magical. We evoke a time period that we associate with magic. And for whatever reason, we associate the medieval period with magic. I mean, there's lots of reasons why we do that. But I just want to point out that it is very much a construct, right? Just the way we talked about Latin last week being a language of power. And that's a construct. Well, associating medievalism with fantasy and magic, that's also a construct, because there wasn't actual real magic in the medieval period, right? Right? But the way that they believed in magic, or the way that they talked about magic, something about the stories that survive from the medieval period make that time period feel magical. So we tend to do this in fantasy. We tend to make things feel medieval, feel ancient, to evoke a feeling of magic. So that's a little bit of what Rowling's doing by having this world revolve around scrolls and feather pens and ink bottles, just harkening back to antiquity and a feeling of magic. Okay, but then goes on in the article, the very next paragraph. J.K. Rowling thus does something very interesting when she fills Harry Potter's world with real medieval books and documents. She transforms the book and writing itself back into something magical, just at the moment when, so we've been told, its days are numbered. We are reminded that unlike a car or a vacuum cleaner, a book is magic. It doesn't need a magical substitute. It has an almost supernatural power to bear words that contain and then stimulate the extraordinary force of the human imagination. Oh, gosh, I love that, right? Isn't that beautiful? A book is already magical. The way a book works, it already feels like magic to that. And why is that? I mean, obviously she explains a little bit in the article, but it also has a lot to do with the way that books operate as symbols of power and knowledge in our culture. And we talked about this with Dr. Faustus. They are symbols of knowledge and power, often because they are literal repositories of knowledge. And now, there are very many actually magical magic books in this series, right? In book 1, there's the book that screams when he opens it, and then there's later on in the series, is it book 3 or 4, where there's the actual monster book that has fur and like literally tears and rips and bites at things. But even in this book, Ron has a fun description. This is on page 230. Ron tells Harry, "You'd be surprised," said Ron, who was looking apprehensively at the book. This is right after they found the diary in the bathroom. "Some of the books the ministry's confiscated. Dad's told me. There was one that burned your eyes out. And everyone who read Sonnets of a Sorcerer spoke in limericks for the rest of their lives. And some old witch in Bath had a book that you could never stop reading. You just had to wander around with your nose in it, trying to do everything one-handed." So, right, in this world, there are these actually magical books. But by and large, what I find like interesting is that the vast majority of the books in the series are not overtly magical like that. The vast majority of the books are just books, right? They are made with normal parchment, normal ink, normal everything. They look just like books that any muggle would recognize, except, okay, maybe with moving pictures instead of still pictures. But they still operate as repositories of knowledge, and knowledge that is a very crucial source of magical power. When in doubt, go to the library. That's Ron making fun of Hermione, but that is Hermione, right? And it is a repeating pattern in the series that Hermione's bookishness, her ability to read the books and find the knowledge, is what saves the day. And so in book 1, admittedly, it was the chocolate frog card, but still, it was a piece of textual evidence, right? That taught them about the name Nicholas Flamel, and then they were able to find more answers from books. But in this book, Hermione's able to, put some ideas together and go to the library and find the answer, find the crucial answer, learn all about the basilisk. And I will point out, it's super interesting, or very un-Hermione-like, I think. Very uncharacteristic of Hermione to rip that page out of the book and actually write in the margins the word pipes. Most bookish people don't deface books like that. And so I think it's a little bit of a funny moment. But it's a good thing she does that, right? Because in that way, she's able to have that book page in her hand, crumpled in her hand, and Harry and Ron are able to find it after she's been petrified. And so that's another thing that books and writing can do. They can facilitate communication across time and space without the need for Hermione to mediate, right? Like the book itself, the knowledge is there on the page, and all she has to have is the page, and Harry and Ron are able to read it and communicate it, and that's magic. That is magic, right? I feel like we've talked about this a little bit before, that ability of writing, of words, of a page from a book, to be able to communicate knowledge like that, almost like minds communicating, but not, right? Harry and Ron were still able to learn everything they needed to learn from the book. So these books, these dusty old objects of parchment and ink, they're so important to this world and to this magic system and to the plots of all of these books. And magic books are important in a lot of other magic systems too, but if you think back to what we talked enough about Dr. Faustus. If we think back all the way back to A Wizard of Earthsea, there's books in that magic system too. Lots of books in the library. Ged talks about traveling around with his books, but the plot or the actual power doesn't seem to come from or the books don't play. I will say there is the scene where he reads from the book for the very first time and calls the shadow forth for the first time. That scene is pretty crucially important. But at the end, the resolution doesn't come from bookish knowledge. The magical resolution comes from Ged going out and getting experience and doing something. So anyway, I just want to point out that I feel like Hermione's bookishness playing such a crucial role in the action of these books is a lot of fun for me as a bookish person. It may not be fun for everyone, but I love that. I love that the books are important for figuring everything out. They are powerful as repositories of knowledge, right? Which brings me to the diary. Okay, Tom Riddle's diary. This is what we have to spend the most of our time talking about, because if you couldn't already guess, that diary is the reason that I picked book 2 for us to read. And I'm going to do my very best to talk about this diary in a way that doesn't spoil things for those of you who haven't read the rest of the series and are interested in going on. Just know that very much later on in the series, we learn that this diary is more significant than we realize even at the end of this book. It plays a role in the grand scheme of the larger series plot. So I will try not to spoil things too much, but what we know should be enough to be able to talk about this. And so what we have is a diary, a book of blank pages that somehow preserved a memory or a piece of Tom Riddle, who is the young Lord Voldemort's soul. Tom is telling Harry about what happened, okay, about how Ginny found the diary and yada, yada, yada. And this is how he describes it. He said, "So Ginny poured out her soul to me, and her soul happened to be exactly what I wanted. I grew stronger and stronger on a diet of her deepest fears, her darkest secrets. I grew powerful, far more powerful than little Miss Weasley. Powerful enough to start feeding Miss Weasley a few of my secrets, to start pouring a little of my soul back into her." Okay, so here's where I'm going to go off talking for just a minute. And if you can't totally follow this, and if it sounds super weird and doesn't make sense to you, don't even worry about it. This is just one of those theoretical areas that I like to study, okay, and think about a lot. So yeah, one of these theoretical areas, it's called book history. And one of the big questions that scholars who work in book history that they like to ask is, what is a book? Is a book a material object? Now, this may seem like a completely ludicrous and ridiculous question, but that's what we do in academia. We ask completely ludicrous and ridiculous questions, and it leads us to interesting places. So, right, of course, a book is a material object, right? You can hold a book in your hands, unless we're talking about ebooks or audiobooks, but like, we're not going to go there, we're not going to complicate this. So yes, right, like a book is a material thing that you hold in your hands, okay? But let's think through this. Let me talk through this, okay? So let's use Jane Austen as an example. Let's say Pride and Prejudice, okay? So somewhere out there is a first edition Pride and Prejudice. But then it got printed again. And then it was so popular that it got printed again. And over the years, it kept getting reprinted, and it got new covers and new designs and new fonts. And there's so many different versions of Pride and Prejudice today, right? So many different versions. And when I tell you to think of the book Pride and Prejudice, what do you think of? Okay, the vast majority of you are going to think of the characters. You're going to think of Lizzie or Darcy, or you're going to think of the plot, or you're going to think of whatever it is in your head that you know about. I'm assuming that you've read Pride and Prejudice. That may not be true. Maybe you haven't. Anyway, ignore that. I'm just saying that when I tell you to think of Pride and Prejudice, something comes into your head that is, the vast majority of the time, not a physical object. But maybe it is. Maybe you do think of the physical object that you first read Pride and Prejudice from. But that physical object is going to look different than the physical object in my mind when I think of my book version of Pride and Prejudice. So are we thinking of different books? No, we're just thinking of different copies. We're thinking of different editions. But we're thinking of the same book, right? So what is that book that we're thinking of? What is a book? Is it a material object? And like, if you followed me through that thought exercise, the answer might be no, actually. That what we're thinking of that's the same is not the material object. What we're thinking of is maybe it's the certain set of words in a certain order that make up the book. But then we can get into ideas of translation or, like new editions where changes are made or something like that. And then it's not exactly the same word order, but it's still the same book, right? Like someone can read War and Peace in Russian and then read it in English, not the same words in the same order, but still the same book. maybe now there are some sticklers who are going to argue and say no, that it's not the same book, that you are reading completely different books. But I think the vast majority of us sort of understand, no, you've read the same book, or we can at least talk about this as a book. But what is it that we're talking about? What is a book? And one analogy that I like to use to sort of think through this conundrum is that a book is like a soul. We can only know a soul through the material physical body that it is housed in, through the edition of the book that we read in our hands. But the physical object of the book is only like the body. The book itself, the words that can be transferred from one object to another, that is more like a soul. Now, I know that we had this thorny discussion back in The Emperor's Soul talking about what a soul is. So this analogy may fall apart depending on your definition of what a soul is, and whether or not non-living things can have a soul. But it is an analogy, keep it in mind, just an analogy. And see if you can't see that. A soul is non-material, right? Like something that is separate from the material object. A soul might also be defined as immortal, but we're going to come back and revisit that term in just a second. But the idea that I sort of want to put out there is that we only know souls because they're housed in physical objects, right? We can only recognize a soul because we can see the physical object that it's in. The soul somehow can transcend that. And I feel like a book is like that, right? A book is only knowable because we can pick up a book and read it. But there's something in that book that transcends the physical object and that we can talk about, even though we've all looked at different physical copies of it. So when we think about books as souls, I'm going to bring this back to Harry Potter now, bring it back to this specific moment in Harry Potter. Well, actually, not this specific moment, but let's just talk about versions of Harry Potter first. Maybe this will help too. Instead of Pride and Prejudice, let's just talk about Harry Potter. So when I think of Harry Potter, I think of this version of the book, this specific edition. This is my original copy that I got when I was in 7th grade. It is a first edition Harry Potter, right? First printing, and original cover design and all of that. And this size, this shape, this cover design, even down to the font, this is what I think of as Harry Potter. When I think of Harry Potter books, like this is the image in my head of what Harry Potter is supposed to look like. And I will be honest that when they started coming out with new editions of Harry Potter in different covers and different features, my first reaction was, no, you can't do that. That's not Harry Potter. Harry Potter has to look like this forever or it's not Harry Potter. But like now we own this version. This is the beautiful illustrated version of this book, this second book of Harry Potter. And it's beautiful and it's gorgeous. And this is the version that my son thinks of as Harry Potter. This is the one that he read. And so this is the version he, connects with Harry Potter. It's different. They're both different versions, but it's the same book, right? The soul of the book, I guess, is still the same, whatever that soul is. And perhaps soul, is another term for story in this case. The story is the same. Actually, the term for soul might be memory. But there's memory and story. Lots we could dig into there. I'll try not to, but think about how a soul could be defined as memory. A soul could be defined as a collection of the memories of a person, and actually some cultures absolutely believe this, that souls only exist as long as the memory of that person is preserved. Coco, have we all seen Coco, right? Like that's the idea there in that movie, in that culture. So in this definition of a soul, the analogy with books becomes even more intertwined, because what is a book except a record of memory? A record of memory, a record of story, a record of someone, the author's memories maybe, or someone, a culture's memories, a record of their knowledge, a record of their experiences, a record of their stories. What is anything we've written and preserved in books except records of our memories in language? When something gets written down, when memories become preserved this way, they achieve a form of immortality. Shakespeare wrote sonnets about this idea, about the way to achieve immortality is to never have your name forgotten, is to have it written, have it in writing, have it printed, right? Have it last on the page long after your body. So there's this very much interconnected web here between concepts of memory, of records, of stories, of knowledge, of language, and of all of that being housed in human bodies, but also being housed in books. It's always been very interconnected, and so I personally find the term soul to be a very fitting way to think about that all those connections. A soul is a memory, a written record, an immortal piece of life, and it can be in either a person or in a book recording that person. So all of that build up, all of that thought theory, if you were able to follow all of that, I find it incredibly appropriate that the first time Voldemort tries to preserve a piece of his soul to gain immortality, he chooses to preserve his soul in the physical object of a book, a diary. And a diary is already a record, perhaps the most direct and personal sort of record of a human soul, right? And while Voldemort didn't leave it in the traditional way, leave his soul in the traditional way of writing, right? Like, that's the traditional way we use a diary to record a version of our soul. He still did choose to house this immortal part of his soul in a book. He chose a book as his first non-human body. And those of you who haven't read the rest of the series, disregard my use of the term first until later on. But yes, he chose a book to be the body of the soul outside his body. But we need to come back to the idea of immortality. We've got to talk about this because are souls actually immortal? And again, it absolutely depends on how you define it or how you answer questions of the relationship between a soul and its material object. And we can't really answer these questions. At least we can't for human souls right now, because none of us can know one way or the another. We can't know souls other than through their physical manifestations, other than through the physical bodies of people. And physical bodies are not immortal. And I must point out, neither are physical books. Words only preserve human souls as long as the physical objects which hold those words survive. And books, like bodies, die every day. They may last longer than most human bodies, depending on the material. You can have really cheap, crappy books that die in 10 years or less. But even really well-made books will only last for so long. Books deteriorate. Books get destroyed. They are not immortal. And if the souls of books, if the words that are written in books are not carefully shepherded into new bodies, into new editions, then when those physical books get destroyed, those words can be lost. And what happens? What happens to those souls, right? Is there somewhere that they go? Is there somewhere that human souls go? Is there somewhere that the souls of books go? We don't know. But a very simple way to kill this piece of Voldemort's soul was to damage the book. to literally stab it through with a poisonous fang and let the ink bleed out. And I know I already mentioned this for those of you who participated in our Zoom meeting a couple weeks ago, but this is the third book in a row that we've read that has ended with either a book being destroyed or, talk of books being destroyed. The end of Emperor's Soul, Gawatona burns the book of Shai's notes. At the end of Faustus, I'll burn my books, O Mephistopheles. The end of this book, the diary gets destroyed. And why is that so powerful, right? Why is it so tragic when books are burned? Why is it so powerful when a book is destroyed? And I think it's, for the answer for me at least, it's because the physical body of a soul is being destroyed. Does that book continue to exist somewhere outside of its physical form? Do human souls exist somewhere outside of their physical bodies? Can memory continue without a body? We don't know. And so we weep when a human body dies, and we weep when a book is burned. Maybe not in this case. Maybe we are not sad that this particular book is destroyed because it housed an evil soul. But in general, right? We feel that sort of connection with books. At least theoretically, or in my opinion, all right? Okay, so I'm possibly entirely making too much out of all of this. Maybe you've listened to this discussion and you're just like, I don't know. You can tell me your thoughts on some of this. There is so much else that we could talk about from this book, a million other themes. Perhaps one of the most famous quotes from all the series is in this book, when Dumbledore is talking to Harry at the end, and he says, hold on, let me get there. It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. I'm pretty positive you've probably heard that quoted somewhere before. It's beautiful. So many other things we could talk about. Lots and lots going on in this book. Remember to leave your comments below. You can talk about anything from this lecture, telling me if I'm crazy thinking that books have souls, or feel free to bring up anything else from the book that you are interested in talking about. Any part, like anything, right? Do we want to talk about Dobby? Do we want to talk about spiders? Do we want to talk about whatever else? Lots we could have talked about from this book. Bring up whatever you want in the comments, and remember to reply to one of your friends' comments, one of your classmates' comments. And I will have one final video for you next week as sort of just like a closing lecture to the semester. I will also be setting up an optional Zoom meeting for next week. So you won't be required to attend, but if you just want to come and meet and all say our final farewells for the end of the course, that'll be happening next week. Otherwise, that's it. This is our last book. We're done. And just work on finishing up your projects. I look forward to seeing them next week. All right, bye guys.